Hello once again. Continuing in this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off. In the last episode, which was 18.3b, and we talked about the family changing social patterns, birth rates, what it was like to be married back in the 18th century into the early 19th century. Today we're going to talk about a really important economic change, and that would be, of course, the agricultural revolution. Now, I know you're probably thinking, blah, 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 farming, who cares? But listen, this is going to be a game changer. It's going to be a game changer in how people live. It's going to, as we already talked about, increase life expectancy and create a population explosion. But it's also going to lead to a very, very important phase in human history, which is the Industrial Revolution. Which, again, will change everything to a consumer-based society and really starts us on a path to what we're familiar with today. So the first thing we need to understand is, what was agriculture like before this revolution, prior to 1700? And what you had was peasants and artisans had about the same standard of living as in the Middle Ages. It never changes. Go back to the 1300s, go back to the 1200s, go back to the 1700s. It was still meager, and it was still pretty bad. Most people battled hunger, starvation, lacked sufficient clothing and decent housing, just miserable. And a big part of this is because there was not really any agricultural innovation really since the Middle Ages. And you think about it, 80% of Western Europe's population were farmers, and the percentage was even higher in Eastern Europe. The Netherlands was probably the only exception where it was more urban and mercantile, but agricultural output was very low compared to modern standards. Now, there's a couple reasons why before I get into the open field system, but you think about it. Think of the social structure, the nobility, the clergy, the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate being everybody else. You're born into that. It's hereditary. There really is no incentive for anybody to do anything other, if you're in the third estate, to survive. And there's really the people that own the majority of the land, the nobility, they have the land, they're rich. There's really no incentive for them to produce more. So again, very, very stagnant from the Middle Ages up until the 1700s. Now, the predominant agricultural technique since the Middle Ages was the open field system, which is more or less what I like to call, it was a free-for-all. There were common areas and common lands that were open. They were open strips of land for agriculture. They weren't divided by any fences or hedges or anything like that. It was basically where the community went to farm together, communal. Again, what mi casa, su casa, that kind of stuff. And there really wasn't much organization there. And because of it, it was, again, self-sufficient, but there wasn't really much incentive to create a surplus. Generation to generation, this stayed the same. Again, family traditions, community traditions, nobody really ever thought to change it. And one of the problems with this technique it was the exhaustion of soil. It was commonplace. Eventually, a third to half of lands were allowed to lie fallow, which means you didn't grow anything there on any given year, so that the soil could recover. And the fact that they did that prohibited them from producing more and more food. So this is why the population was stagnant. This is why at times there was famine. This is at times people were more and more susceptible to disease. So villages maintained open meadows for hay and natural pasture, meaning, not just open field system for agriculture, but it was open system for livestock as well. And as we know, peasants were often heavily taxed, so this kind of further stagnated the economy, and serfs in Eastern Europe were far worse off than the farmers were in Western Europe. Okay, so what starts to happen here? What starts to change? Well, there was a change in the increase of the amount of food in production, and that's what we're going to do and go into. First of all, one of the reasons why was there was more farmland. In the 18th century, England, the Netherlands, and France became the leaders for increased agriculture, industry, and trade that, again, resulted in that population growth that you read about earlier in the chapter. And part of that was the scientific revolution. Science and technology started to become applied to everything, including agriculture. And in the Low Countries, they led the way. They paved the way. The increased population meant that finding new methods, they had to find new methods of agriculture to sustain their population. And you saw the growth of towns and cities that we talked about in the Netherlands. That's why they led the way here. which created major markets for food produced in the countryside. To sustain a city, you have to have food to support the people living there. So in the Netherlands, they started to regionally specialize, all right? And they specialized certain areas just for farming, certain regions for fishing, and certain regions just for shipping. So the towns and the cities were usually used for mercantile activities, and then obviously in the countryside it was for farming. I know that's not earth-shattering news to you, but by the mid-17th century, what the Dutch start to do is they actually end the open field system. They start to enclose their field. They start to rotate crops. And they employed use of manure for fertilizer and planted a wide variety of crops, kind of diversifying the foods that they produced. And part of this was they had a free and capitalistic society, as we've already talked about here. And what ends up changing this is, and why they enclose, the people that own the land decide they're going to enclose their land, and they're going to grow. They're going to pay attention to science, and they're going to do what they can to grow the most food for profit. So you have capitalism here with profit incentives for farmers to be more productive. One of the things they did was they said, we got all this land, but a lot of it's marshy, and it's not good for farming, so they drained it. All right, much of Holland had been once marshland, and it was covered by ocean water. So the Dutch became the world leaders in reclaiming wetlands through drainage. And Cornelius Vermuyden was the most famous of these Dutch engineers in draining techniques. So drainage was later used extensively in southern England to create new farmlands, and that's what they would do. They would dam the ocean back, they'd build dikes and canals, and so what they were able to do was build very fertile, more fertile farmland to increase their agricultural output. Same thing kind of happens in England. All right, by 1870, crop yields had tripled since 1700, with only a 14% increase in people working the land. So you can see they're getting more and more efficient. A guy named Charles Townsend pioneered crop rotation in England, and as an English ambassador to the Netherlands, he saw this firsthand. But the Dutch using nitrogen-rich crops such as turnips and clover to replenish the soil so it wasn't fallow. All right, so instead of growing nothing, when they were rotating the crops, they would plant turnips and clover and things of that nature, which actually have the ability to put nitrogen back in the soil. And interestingly enough, a little bit later on, you can feed the turnips and you can feed the clover to livestock. So you're actually, you know, you're double dipping. You're putting more nitrogen and nutrients, I was trying to say, into the soil, and at the same time you're able to feed more livestock and increase your livestock. And if you can increase your livestock, obviously there's more meat for people. It's going to lead to a population explosion there. More livestock also poop more, so you're going to have more manure that is able to be used for fertilizer. So that, on top of the draining techniques that he brought back to England, they kind of nicknamed him Turnip Townsend. And again, so, you know, mass slaughter of animals no longer needed to prior to winter, and animal feed was now available, so people ate more fresh meat than ever, and they had actually the ability to preserve surplus meat through salting. So the diet of most Europeans is getting better on average. By 1740, new agricultural techniques become popular. And again, why are these coming? Why are these coming about? Because people are seeing a need here and demand, and we're getting more and more towards a capitalist society. So a guy named Jethro Tull comes about with his seed drill, and he's a good example of how empiricism of the scientific revolution was applied to agriculture. So this seed drill allows for the sowing of crops in a straight row rather than scattering it by hand, so it makes it more efficient. He used horses for plowing rather than the slower oxen. A guy named Robert Bakewell also comes along and pioneers selective breeding of livestock. So you have larger and healthier animals start to become developed. And so again, as I said in the last slide, results are availability, increasing the availability of meat, wool, leather, soap, candle tallow, and again, more poop for fertilizing. So, you know, again, what's the big deal here? Increases in food production lead to all of these things. So we have the population explosion. We're tying this back to that. You had more farmland in the 18th century in those particular places that we mentioned, England, Netherlands, and France. They become the leaders for agriculture, but they also will soon enough become leaders in industry and trade because of their population growth. increased yields per acre. You had more food grown on the same amount of land. You had, as we said, more healthier livestock, and of course, more poop. And also, one of the things that they mentioned that I think is important here is that there's an improved climate. We talk about climate change. The 18th century sees an increase in the temperature from the so-called Little Ice Age that plagued Europe in the 16th and 17th century. So throw that on there, longer growing season. You have a better opportunity to grow new foods. Another big example here to change the patterns and lead to an agricultural revolution was, of course, the Columbian Exchange. And it's kind of a revolution in diet. We've talked a little bit about this in chapter 14, but you had new foods, as you see on this chart, from the New World became increasingly available in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. An example, potatoes and corn were among the most important that changed Europeans' diet, which were highly nutritious and relatively easy to grow for poor people and rich people alike. Again, leading to longer life expectancy. One other important maneuver here is the enclosure movement. We kind of started to talk about this a little bit earlier with the drainage of land, but the first enclosure, we talked a little bit about this in England in the 16th century, where landowners sought to increase profits from wool production, and they started to enclose their fields for raising sheep. And again, if you remember during the English Civil War, you had the levelers and the diggers, which were kind of early communists. They wanted to get rid of those hedges, and they wanted back to the open field where you shared everything. But anyway, that didn't happen. But this enclosure movement, the second enclosure movement, differs a little bit because it's basically largely on agriculture, not wool production or clothing, textiles. So the enclosure movement, obviously that brings an end to the open field system, and landowners start to consolidate their scattered holdings into compact fields that they started to fence off. So common pasture lands also were enclosed and shut off. So the result is the commercialization of agriculture. It goes big time business. Large landowners prospered, invested in more and more technology, as we just talked about with Jethro Tull. Machinery, breeding, cultivation methods, you name it, they invested in it, and it increased in the number of large and middle-sized farms. Okay, small farms are on the way out, large farms, middle-sized farms on the way in, and Parliament passes over 3,000 enclosure acts in the late 18th century and early 19th century that will benefit the filthy rich, the large landowners. And why would that be? Because who controls power in Parliament? It'd be the wealthy landowners. An example of this would be the Corn Laws in 1815. We'll talk a little bit about this in when we get into the 19th century, but the Corn Laws that are passed during the last phase of the Napoleonic era benefits landowners. You get high tariffs that are placed on foreign grain, forcing people to buy from England. And again, this will hurt the poor as they couldn't afford the increases in the food prices, and it was one of the most notorious examples of a law that benefited the wealthy at the expense of the English peasantry. So let's talk a little bit more about the enclosure movement's impact on the peasantry, because that's one of the themes. How did these demographic changes, how did they affect the lower class peoples? Well, many were forced off their lands that had once been common. Many have found themselves, they had to move into towns or cities to look for work, since work was less available in the countryside. They had to find work in the factories that are going to emerge as a result of the Industrial Revolution, or they had to chill in poorhouses like in Oliver Twist. But many people became impoverished farm laborers. They had to migrate, they had to go, they had to work for some of those larger farmers, the large landowners, if you will, and obviously that's not what they wanted to do. They wanted to be self-sufficient. They wanted to do it themselves, but you can't do that anymore. Women also had no way to raise animals on common lands for extra money on their own. So impact on women is pretty crazy. In traditional communities, women had usually been an indispensable part of a household's economic survival. Women farmed, they raised animals, they oversaw important functions of the household. Well, the enclosure of common lands meant that women and men were forced off the land, as we've already said, and the economic opportunities for women were thus decreased significantly. Many families with daughters were eager to get them out of the house as they were an extra mouth to feed. So you start to talk about in American history, like the Lowell factories that employed women. That's an example of that happening in the young United States as well. And young women more and more went to cities or towns where they became domestic workers and worked for the rich people, or in many cases when they didn't have any other alternative to survive, they turned to prostitution. Okay, so families who were able to get by in the countryside often supplemented their income through the cottage industry, or what they call the putting out system, which was through the spinning and weaving textile trade. And women played an important role in spinning and weaving, as we'll talk about in the cottage industry. But basically, you have a strict hierarchical structure that emerged. Landowners, the gentry, the few landowners, they dominated the economy, as I said. They dominated parliament. They dominated politics. And then you had strong and prosperous tenant farmers who rented land from the large landowners. And then you had some small peasant farmers who owned land, but the majority of people, a huge number of peasants, became simple wage earners on farms or in the cottage industry. And so you start to see this struggle between landowners and peasantry occur. There were game laws that were passed on behalf of the landowners, where any animals or owners on vast lands could not be hunted for food, kind of like the Peasants' Revolt in 1524. And peasants who were without food, if they were caught sneaking onto these lands, they would risk severe punishment if they were caught. So, in the context of things, there's a historical debate on the enclosure movement. The traditional view is that enclosure pushed thousands of peasants out of the countryside and resulted in abject poverty for those who remained, and that it was a theory put forth by Karl Marx in the 19th century. But more recent research says that the negative effects of enclosure are actually more and more exaggerated. They say that many thousands remained in the countryside working as prosperous tenant farmers, small landowners, or wage earners. So as much as 50% of England's farmland was already enclosed by 1750. So in 1700, there was a ratio of 2 landless laborers for every self-sufficient farmer, and that number wasn't significantly larger by 1750. So in the late 17th and early 18th century, lands were enclosed by mutual agreement between all of the classes and the village landowners. So, the impact, in summary, of the agricultural revolution, it led to Europe's population explosion with the surplus food. The enclosure movement altered the society patterns in the countryside. Common lands were enclosed, thus changing traditional village life, and widespread migration to the cities resulted in urbanization, which will fuel the Industrial Revolution. And again, women, they were too adversely affected. The cottage industry will emerge as a means of supplementing a farm family's income, and we'll talk about that, and that'll be short-lived. But economically, the increased food supply resulted in lower food prices that enabled people to spend more money on consumer goods. Again, I repeat, economically, the increased supply of food resulted in lower food prices that enabled people to spend more on consumer goods. What are we going to talk about next? Soon? The Industrial Revolution. Can't have an industrial revolution if there's not a market for people to buy things. Thanks for tuning in.